All right. So, are there any questions about competition up to this point or the ideal free distribution in particular? Okay, I had asked you guys to go home also and look at game theory because we went through game theory, and in particular, we had talked about the prisoner's dilemma. And what did I ask you to do? Yeah, change the values, change the rewards and the costs, and see what effect that might have. If you made the rewards lower, what would happen to the outcome of the game in terms of the ratio? Remember, as it was presented in your textbook, the ratio of individuals playing hawk to dove was 50% should play hawk and 50% should play dove. What does that do to the ratio if the rewards to the winner decrease rather? When you calculate the ratio at equilibrium. Did you do it by reducing or did you do it by increasing?
I did one reducing, but I think I did it wrong. I think I messed up.
What did you find?
I got that it was still 50%.
Oh, it shouldn't have been 50%.
I think I missed a negative sign when I was doing my equation.
Okay.
I was like, that's right.
It shouldn't stay 50%. No. Okay. What did you find?
When you say that, do you mean like the dove reward increases well, right?
So the reward for winning is just doesn't matter who wins, hawk or dove. What it changes is the value of V. So in this case, it would be 1/2 of let's say you reduce V to 25. Or let's keep the math easy and reduce V to 20. So if we change the equation, the reward for winning is plus 20. The cost of injury is still minus 100. And when you lose, you still get nothing. What that changes, it doesn't change anything about, on half of the occasions you win, half of the occasions you get injured. What it changes is essentially what the reward is. So if half of the time you win as a hawk and half of the time you are injured, but then you also win all the time that you are, well, let's just go back and do it this way. If you get half the times you win, half the times you're injured, it would be 1/2. Whoa, that is covered in some fluid. It has now wrecked my marker. It's still a little on the wet side. So half the time you win, but now winning only gains you 20. You still half the time get injured. And so this is half of 20 is 10. This is minus 50. So in this case, the net effect of a hawk going up against a hawk is now minus 40. So that also then changes the situation for doves against doves because they get, once again, half of 20, which would be 10 down here, which it was plus 25. Doesn't change. Oh yeah, it does change the situation here as well. So if you're a hawk, if you're a hawk, your reward is the proportion of hawks times minus 40 plus the proportion of doves times plus 20, right? Okay? And the dove equation is simple because when the dove goes up against a hawk, it gets nothing. But when a dove goes up against another dove, it's the frequency of doves multiplied times half of the reward, which is 10, right? So how do we solve for the equilibrium condition? Take those and put them equal to one another. H, so that'd be minus 40H plus 20 minus 20H equals 10 minus 10H. So minus 40 and minus 20 is minus 60H plus 20 equals 10 minus 10H. If we add 60H to each side, that then gives us 20, 10 plus 60. H minus 10 minus 10, that's 10 here and 60H here. Divide by 60, divide by 60. So, oh, it should be 50H. Sorry, 50H. 50H. 50. See, everybody does math badly, Elizabeth. It's not just you. So, that's essentially 1/5 hawks is, which basically means that 4/5 of the time you should play dove. So it's kind of exactly what you would expect. As the advantage of being a hawk goes down in terms of gain, because the advantage of being a hawk is whenever you go up against a dove, you win, but as you change the situation, in this case, winning means less. And so when winning means less and the cost of injury doesn't change, being a hawk becomes less and less profitable. And as a result, you would expect less hawks in your environment. So that's the nature of this. So be prepared for me on the test day after tomorrow, to give you a hawk-dove game where I've basically altered the conditions under which the hawk-dove game functions. And so one of the best ways to prepare for that is to actually take the hawk game dove and say, well, what if I increase or decrease the reward for winning? What if I increase or decrease the cost for being injured? What if I leave the cost of injury alone, but you just get injured less frequently or more frequently? All of these things are things that you could go in and change about this particular evolutionary game that would affect the ending ratio of hawks to doves in this particular system. Increase the reward, that will favor hawks if you don't change anything else. Decrease the reward, that favors doves if you don't change anything else. Increase the amount of injury, that doesn't favor hawks, it favors doves. Decrease the cost of energy, once again changing nothing else. Increases the reward for hawks, therefore doesn't favor doves. Increasing the frequency at which, changing the fraction in front of here, the frequency at which you are injured. If it increases, that works less in the favor of hawks, so doves should be seen to increase. Decreasing the frequency of that injury cost would then, once again, favor hawks, and as a result, you would have fewer doves. So this is why we do game theory, is because it helps us think about the choices that organisms have, and it helps us think about them in quantitative sorts of ways. ideal free distribution. We got to the end where we were talking about the assumptions. Individuals possess complete information, and that information is without error, and individuals are perfectly free to move around because there's no interference competition. And I demonstrated that with markers last time and winded myself by basically walking around the room collecting markers. Strangely enough, I clearly need more exercise. So, some experimental tests of ideal free distribution. Fish are really kind of nice to work with because they're easily manipulable. And so, and I think I've drawn this on the board in the past. You can manipulate fish by just placing them in an aquarium tank. All right, I'm going to have to just retire that guy. Actually, there's fluid all over this table over here. I have no idea what that is about. Ugh. And you can have a pipe. Well, and that's the guy who got wet earlier. Slowly retiring all my pins. You can place a pipe over one end and a pipe over the other end, and these pipes will deliver food to the fishes. And on one end, you can drop food at a particular rate, and at the other end, you can drop that food at roughly half the weight, or half the rate, rather. And so, if you draw a vertical line in the tank, you have fish. Because the fish are being rewarded by twice as much food on this side, you can put 4 fish feeding on this side and 2 fish feeding on this side, and each fish is going to be getting the same rate of food delivery to them because there are 2 times the amount of food, there are 2 times the number of fish, as opposed to 1 time the amount of food and 1 time the amount of fish. And so in this way, you can just put fish in a tank, deliver food to them at different rates, and then see how they assort themselves in the tank. If one of these fish swim over to this side of the tank, what has now happened to the rate of delivery per fish over here? It's actually increased and it has gone down over here, whereas it was the same on both sides. And so what should happen is that fish that came over should either go back to where he or she came from, or one of these fish will clue in and say, hey, I'm now achieving less of an energy gain here. I'm going to go over here and see what's happening, and then discovers over there that they get more, and then the whole thing equals out. So the fish don't have to stay on one side of the tank or the other. They can move back and forth, but they will move back and forth in such a way that they will converge on this average where they are distributing themselves among the 2 environments, the low food environment, the high food environment, and they are distributing themselves in a way that is ideal considering the amount of food that's being given to them. Then what you do as a researcher is you are clever enough that you've designed this thing so that it's adjustable, and you switch the amount of food that's being delivered. What do you expect to happen? You will see 2 of these fish leave here, and they will start feeding on this side because now this is the side that has the high food delivery, and this is the side that has the low. And that's what they're showing exactly is happening in this environment. If end A is the low food environment, so this would be A and B. At the beginning, it's the low food environment, and so you see the number of fish on the low food environment side converges at 2. After it converges there, you flip the rate of delivery so that the low food environment is now side B, and you see fish moving over to side A as a result of this. This works with fish. This other example that they have in here is an example done with ducks. One of the things about ducks, if you're at a public pond where there are ducks have gotten in the habit of going to the edge of the pond and eating bread that small children give them. And that's exactly what they did with this experiment. They basically had students feeding ducks at different rates, And basically, they had two different sites. One site where the people were throwing the ducks a lot of bread, and another site where they were throwing less bread. And they found, sorry, they found that the ducks distributed themselves among these two sites in proportion to the amount of food that was being supplied to them. And then when they switched the site, they did exactly what the fishes did. Some of the ducks moved from the high site to what was the low site, because the low site that was low previously was now the high food availability site. So organisms are capable of doing this. Um, Another example in the textbook is an example that you guys are already familiar with. These are dung flies hanging out on what? A big pile of cow poop. And you can see that there are a number of different things going on. There are a number of solitary males. There are some males that are copulating with females. In one case, there's, well, two cases, I guess. There's a male that's in copulation and another male is trying to overtake. And what happens with the cowpat is, and we've talked about this before, the longer the cowpat has been sitting on the ground, what happens to it? It dries out. As it dries out, it becomes less viable as a place to lay eggs. As a result of that, what do females do with old dried cowpats rather than fresh cowpats? They avoid them, so they don't appear to arrive at the cowpat nearly as frequently. So over time, the number of males on a cowpat goes down, but that's because the cowpat is becoming less and less attractive to females. But the end result of this is that if you are a relatively solitary male at an old cowpat, you achieve the same fertilization success as a male that is competing against a lot of males at a fresh cowpat, because there are more males, but there are also more females, but also then competition for those females is higher. And so you can either be competing with a bunch of males on a fresh cowpat and achieve this number of copulations, or you can be the rare male on a cowpat that is not very good, but then you have access to every female that arrives there, which gives you once again the the same degree of success. Now, it increases the amount of time that you have to stay there, but you end up with the same success. This is just another example of the ideal free distribution. Individuals will distribute themselves across the different cow patties based on what their rate of return is, number of females that you get to mate with per unit time. So, any questions on the ideal free distribution? Elizabeth, you look like you have a question.
I was just making sure that I understand.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? So we've talked about the difference between exploitative and interference competition. What's the fundamental difference between those two things? Avery has a sly smile on her face. Go for it, Avery.
I don't smell squinted because I can't see anything very well.
Oh, you need glasses then.
I do have glasses.
Time for bifocals, maybe.
I just don't wear them.
What's one of the fundamental things that affects whether or not a particular example of competition will be exploitative versus interference? Is it something to do with the competitors, or is it something to do with the resource itself? What is it that's different about the resource in those two situations?
I think in exploitative, there's a two like one's better than the other one. Is that right?
No. You can have habitats that are of different densities, but the question is, within that habitat, how is the resource distributed?
What was an example of interference?
You cold cocking me with the chair to keep me from getting the markers. You recall that, right? You were amazingly violent last class period.
Yeah. You missed it all.
So you basically disabled me from getting access to the resource because the resource was what? Well, competition only occurs with limited resources, but what else was it about the distribution of the resource?
It wasn't spread out. It wasn't all together.
So if you're going to protect the resource in this room, where does the resource need to be? It needs to be all in one spot. So when resources are concentrated, when they are in a defensible place, that leads to interference competition because what you do as a competitor is you try and control access to the resource. If the resource is spread out all over everywhere, what does that do to your ability to defend that resource against another competitor? You can't really, and so you shift into exploitative mode where your goal is to gather up as much of the resource as you can before the other competitors get to it. And so widely dispersed resources tend to be prone to exploitative competition. Aggregated resources tend to be the object then of interference competition. So we have to think about what happens when resources are aggregated such that they become a defensible resource. So this is what we refer to as resource defense competition. And so when organisms settle in a particular area, they will tend to defend that resource. But different habitats can have different qualities. So you can have a rich habitat that has defensible resources in it. You can have a poor habitat that has defensible resources in it. But it kind of fills up the same way that the ideal free distribution would say, except that there comes a point where the habitat gets full. And so what happens is over time, as more and more competitors come into this environment where there's a rich habitat and a poor habitat, what you will tend to do is you will tend to fill up the rich habitat until the rich habitat is full. And then after that, you begin to fill up the poor habitat until the poor habitat is full. What makes these individuals going to the poor habitat go to the poor habitat? What is it that makes the individuals who end up going to the poor habitat go to the poor habitat rather than trying to stay in the rich habitat?
Because there's limited resources in the rich, so they get that the same.
So there are more resources, but why not just do what the fish do, which is just freely move back and forth between the two habitats in a way that you get this distribution?
One thing the rich are defending the resources, they're not letting other people.
Yeah, Avery is in the rich habitat with a chair, daring you to come in to the habitat because otherwise she's going to boot you out of the habitat. So when the resource is defensible, there's less movement around than the ideal free distribution would allow because these individuals in the rich habitat are defending that habitat from other individuals coming in. And once they filled that up, that's it. We're in the club. Nobody else is getting into the club. We're putting a bouncer on the door, and you're not allowed. Go to the dive bar. Dive bar fills up, then go to the liquor store and sit on the curb. I don't know what the other alternative would be. So organisms defend the space that has the resource, and as a result, the rich habitat fills up, and then once the rich habitat is full, nobody else is allowed into the rich habitat. And as a result, the poor habitat fills up after that. Now, here's the tricky thing. And this is a confusing graphic. You have to read the caption pretty closely, but there's also a good description of this in the book. When you think about organisms, we normally think of organisms as being kind of equivalent. So the ideal free distribution basically states that, in the case of the fish, put twice as much food over here, half as much food here, you're going to get twice as many fish over here and only one time fish over here. 4 fish versus 2 fish because you got twice as much food coming here than here. However, in this case, we have 6 fish in the low food environment, and we have 6 fish in the high food environment, but that is not what the ideal free distribution would say. What's the difference in this situation here that would make the ideal free distribution in terms of the number of fish not hold true? What's the difference between the 6 fish over here and the 6 fish over here? The 6 fish over here are twice as big as the fish over there. So this is still the ideal free distribution, but rather than the count of fish, we're thinking about what the biomass of fish is. This environment that is getting twice as much food as this environment here, the amount of food per gram of fish is the same in each of those places. So one of the tricky things about thinking about the ideal free distribution or any of these types of models is it also makes an assumption, which is that all individuals are equivalent. When they're not equivalent, you might get things that look on the surface like they're not an ideal free distribution of fishes on each end of the tank, but they are when you start delving into that a little differently. So all of these things would be examples of the ideal free distribution. We normally think of this as being the situation. 4 fish here, 8 fish here, because this side is getting twice as much food as this side. But these 3 larger fish might be the equivalent of 4 slightly smaller fish, and these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 fish might be the equivalent of 6 of these larger fish that are on this side. So the way you run an experiment when you're testing something like this, you have to be fairly rigid about how you're controlling everything. If you have a wide diversity of fish sizes, you're going to get ambiguous results because you didn't control that aspect of the phenotype of the organisms that you were looking at. In theory, all of these represent ideally freely distributed fish, but you have to account for fish size at the individual level in order to come to that conclusion. Questions? All right. When we think about defending a resource, essentially staking out a claim on a resource and essentially saying, the way that I'm going to get access to this resource is by preventing others to get access to this resource, there comes a point when a resource is no longer defensible. And the point at which that resource no longer is defensible is when the cost of defending that resource becomes higher than or equal to the benefit that you gain from defending it. And so in this case, we have a classic diminishing returns curve. So remember I told you at the beginning of the semester, these diminishing return curves are going to be a recurring thing that we see in animal behavior. You gain something from the rich environment. You gain it relatively quickly as territory size increases. As territory size increases, you gain more and more. But there comes a point where getting a bigger and bigger territory to have more and more of the resource becomes a diminishing return. One of the reasons that this becomes a diminishing return is because even though larger territories give you more benefits, larger territories also come with higher costs. And so that's one of the things that leads to this diminishing returns curve. Same thing with the poor environment. It has a lower graph, a lower curve, because there's less resource in the poor environment. But once again, the cost of defending a certain area is the same regardless of what the benefit is of that. And so the cost curve stays the same. So then the question that any organism has if it's going to defend a territory is, how big of a territory should I defend? Well, the size of the territory that you defend is going to be dependent upon the magnitude of the difference between the rich and the poor and the shape of the cost curve. So in this case, the way you figure this out is you essentially ask yourself, where is the largest benefit when you compare the cost to the benefit? What is the cost benefit ratio? Where does that ratio maximize itself? And so you're looking at how far apart is the cost curve from the benefit curve, and you would set a territory size that maximizes that difference between the cost and the benefit. You want the most benefit with the least amount of cost. If you get a territory that is a little higher than that, that cost benefit ratio is smaller. Get a territory that is a little lower than that, and once again, that cost benefit ratio is lower than that one. And so there is an optimal or a maximal ratio between benefit and cost, and that is the size of the territory that you should maintain. Needless to say, it makes sense, it makes intuitive sense that if you're in a rich environment, you might have to maintain a smaller territory to get a benefit simply because the environment is richer. In a poorer environment, you may have to maintain a higher territory, a larger territory, in order to get the maximum benefit because the resource availability in that environment is just not as much. And that's what we see here. But once again, the shape of the benefit curve and the shape and position of the cost curve all determine what the maximum is. And so in this case, the rich environment increases in abundance of resources relatively quickly, but then it plateaus off very sharply. So rather than having this nice gradual diminishing returns curve, you have a linear increase in resource availability that then plateaus off at an asymptote abruptly. And in this case, it pays to have the largest territory possible at that asymptote because that represents the largest cost-benefit ratio. But because the poor environment also is increasing linearly up to the same plateau, you can actually have a poor environment supporting a much smaller territory simply because the shape of the benefit curves, in this case, they're not curves anymore, they're actually linear relationships between the amount of benefit and the total area. So what matters here is where does the maximum distance between the benefit and the cost occur? That then tells you what territory area should be. And presumably, animals are responding to these two things, the cost of defending a territory versus the benefits that you gain from it. Imagine that you have a territory, and one of the things that you have to do is you have to spend time patrolling the edges of your territory. Birds do this a lot. You'll start to see this in the coming weeks as birds come back into this area as they migrate up from the south, and they start to set up their territories. Male birds will spend a tremendous amount of time flying around to the edges of their territory and singing. Well, the act of singing is energetically expensive, and the act of flying around your territory is energetically expensive. And chances are, while you're doing all of that, you're also not feeding. That contributes to the cost of maintaining the territory. And so if you're going to maintain that territory, there must be a pretty good benefit if you're going to spend all that time and energy in maintaining that territory. Do you guys recall back to the Shrike paper? How did they determine what the edges of a shrike's territory was? Do you guys recall?
Did they have like I remember they put this stuff on the fence. That was all where the edge of their territory, where they had their cache.
So they did manipulate the cache, but how did they decide where the edge of the territory for a particular male was? It wasn't necessarily where the cache was located. How did they delineate where that male's territory is? This is a pretty common thing that we do in bird studies. They presented something to what they thought was the resident male, right? What did they present to the resident male? split the paper. Do you guys all have digital copies of the paper? Hmm? Oh, I have no idea. Oh, it was the second day of class. So I guess I do have an idea. It's the second day of class. Mm-hmm. Uh, from June 1987 to June 1988, we mapped territories of 12 male northern shrikes by general observation of their activity and observation of the reaction of the males to taped songs of other males and to what? A stuffed dummy bird. What you do is you take a stuffed dummy and you put it at what you think is the edge of the shrike's territory, and the shrike either leaves it alone or it does what? Comes over and attacks it. And as soon as you move it close enough to the territory of that male, you shift from where it leaves it alone to where it comes over and attacks it. That is time and energy and potential cost of injury of defending a territory. Presumably that territory has food in it for that male shrike and its mates, and potentially other resources. And so the cost of defending that territory could be something like energy and time, but it could also be potential for injury, because if you attack a shrike that is capable of taking over your territory, not only do you lose your territory, but you also might become injured in the interaction. So these costs can be both energetic, but they can also be of other forms. Resource defense, um, competition. Um, we will revisit this because oftentimes we think of resources as being food, but another thing that individuals engage in, males in particular, is males can also treat females as a potential resource. And so you will also see what in the literature what people refer to as resource defense polygyny, a situation in which a male controls access to a resource because that resource attracts females, and then in the process of defending that resource, that male is also then defending his harem of females. And so this resource distribution not only affects competition for whatever the resource is, but can also affect competition for mates. And you can view potential mates as a resource in the same way that you can view food, water, shelter as resources as well. Questions about resource defense? All right. Another thing that this is an area that the students sometimes find a little confusing is competition in the context of kind of two different behavioral strategies or tactics known as producer versus scrounger. And a producer is an individual that tends to, in the process of gathering its own resources, it tends to liberate resources that can then be picked up by other individuals. The thing that I think about when I think about this is hunting dogs. Any of you guys ever go hunting for geese or quail or anything like that? No hunters in the group?
There's only three of us.
I know people that do, I just never thought myself.
Are you guys from the Midwest or not? Well, you're not originally.
I've been hunting before, just not with a dog.
Well, when you go hunting with the dog, what's the purpose of the dog? That's the secondary purpose of the dog. What's the first purpose of the dog? You send the dog into the grass to flush the quail into the air, then you shoot the birds out, and then the dog goes and gets them and brings them back to you. But the first purpose of the dog is actually to make the prey reveal themselves. In this case, the dog really is a producer. A dog is an individual, in this case, that makes a resource available, in this case, to the hunter, who then scrounges off of the efforts of the dog. And I think gives him a sad little treat for performing well. So this is kind of the producer scrounger sort of idea. There are some types of organisms that in the process of them going about the process of getting a resource, they then make that resource available to others. Inevitably, producers oftentimes have higher fitness because they're the ones that have first shot at the resource that they're exploiting, and then the scroungers come back. And so we typically see this type of relationship where producers have a higher fitness than scroungers, regardless of the proportion of the population of scroungers. But you can imagine that there would come a point where there are so many scroungers that everybody's scrounging and nobody is producing. And so in that case, you might expect scroungers to get better benefits when they're low in abundance, but as the scrounger population increases, the producers are the ones that get first access to the resource, and so they tend to do better than scroungers when there are a lot of scroungers around. Can you guys think of producer scrounger situations in higher education, in your courses, among your peers? Avery has an idea. No? Then why do you have that sly look on your face? Like, I can think of an example of this. You guys have never asked me for extra credit in this class so far yet. Why? Well, don't I feel offended and stereotyped and you're probably correct.
I've used a teacher before, and I know we don't.
I am very reluctant to give extra credit. So you know not to ask me. Have you been in classes where you do get extra credit?
Yeah.
Do you get extra credit because everybody asks for extra credit? No.
People doing bad usually.
People doing poorly oftentimes ask for it. Sometimes people doing well ask for it because they want better grades because they're planning on going to medical school and things like this. There are producers of extra credit in higher education. You will see them in classes where you think you have a pair of getting extra credit. You won't see them in my classes because students learn fairly early on that I'm not the type to give extra credit. Have you seen people in classes do this? Ask the professor for extra credit? Is it always consistently the same people?
Yeah.
It is. Do you get the extra credit as a result of those people's effort?
Yeah.
Oh, Avery's a scrounger. She's a good competitor in an interference sort of way, and she's also a good scrounger. So there are some producers who are pestering the faculty member for extra credit, and then everybody in the class benefits from that because you don't just give extra credit to one student because that would be unfair and discriminatory. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. You have to make that extra credit available to everybody. So these people who ask for extra credit and get it, that then is a benefit that accrues to the entire class. Producers versus scroungers. That's fine. You want to scrounge extra credit? Go for it. But that's another analogy to get this point across. Now, in the case of extra credit, is it the left-hand side or the right-hand side that would apply most to something like producing extra credit and scrounging for extra credit? Is there only a certain amount of extra credit to go around? And if there are too many scroungers, then there's not enough extra credit to go around? No, plenty of extra credit because extra credit's arbitrary. So it would be the left-hand side. the number of scroungers doesn't affect the value of the extra credit for the producers. As a matter of fact, in this case, would the scrounger and the producer curve even be different? No, it wouldn't. The same benefit would occur to scroungers as it does to producers. I think my video might have just cut off. Oh, no, it's still going. But this is different if you're out foraging. If you're out foraging and you're a producer, it may be that when you're a producer, you're producing enough that you get plenty, but there are scroungers that aren't very common and they get whatever is left. And then as the number of scroungers increase, more and more scroungers are vying for the leftovers after the producers are done, and then the benefit to each individual scrounger goes down because there are just too many scroungers. Can you think, from watching nature documentaries and things like this, can you think of a producer scrounger scenario out in nature? It's been filmed a number of different times.
I can't think of like, I know like if like a lion kills like a big product, and then there's other animals that come in. So hyenas.
Yeah, the hyenas will come in and they'll actually try and take the carcass away from a lion. And the lion will engage in interference competition sort of behaviors, trying to defend that locally available resource that is very defensible, and keep it away from the hyenas. But you could definitely view the lion-hyena situation as a producer-scrounger thing. In some cases, it's the lion that produces, and in some cases, it's the hyena that produces. And so that role will shift depending on what the particulars of any particular interaction are. So once again, just like with hawk and dove, there is an equilibrium whenever you have these two lines crossing. Whenever the decline in the benefit to scroungers is relatively steep and the decline of the producers is relatively shallow, you'll have these two lines crossing. And at that point, that represents a ratio of how many scroungers there will be to how many producers there will be as the proportion of scroungers increases. And so what you can do with this is you can actually think about a situation where you have, in this case, once again, they're looking at birds, and the birds are on either side of a barrier. And as the birds on one side of the barrier eat, it produces food on the other side of the barrier. And so these represent perches, if I'm recalling correctly. And these birds on this side will come, and as they feed, it releases food onto the other side. But the rate at which that food is produced on the other side varies depending on what the researcher decides. And the difference between uncovered and covered, let's go down to the caption and remind ourselves of what is going on here. So the birds sit on perches, they pull a string to release food into the dish. On the scrounger side, birds have to wait for producers to make food available. B is the results from one flock showing how foraging rate of producers and scroungers varies with the number of birds in the scrounger department. There are 6 birds in total in the flock. In the graph to the left, the feeding dishes were uncovered and the scrounger producer feeding rate when 2 or 3 birds in the flock are scroungers. So in the right-hand graph, the dishes were covered, which reduced scrounger but not producer food access. So uncovered means that the scroungers have access to the food better. In the covered situation, they have less access, and as a result of having less access, they actually have a lower gain curve. And so what happens is in covered environments, you tend to have fewer scroungers because the food is less accessible. But when the food is uncovered, you tend to have more scroungers because the food is more available to the scroungers. As these birds release food, in this case, it's not very available when it gets released to this side. In this case, it's completely available as it gets released to this side. And as a result, this is they did another one of these switch experiments where they switched what was happening midway through the experiment. And when the food was covered, you saw that the number of scroungers went down, but then as soon as they uncovered the food and made it more available, it went up. and it went up to close to, well, actually above where the equilibrium would have predicted it, which is a little over 2.5 scroungers, rather than down here where it was less than 1 scrounger. So once again, this is an ideal free distribution kind of situation where individuals distribute themselves on the producer side versus the scrounger side, depending upon what the gain is for the two types of behaviors. In both cases, the producers and the scroungers are getting about the same benefit. Producers and scroungers getting the same benefit. Even though the distribution of scroungers is higher in this case, because the food is uncovered, they're getting the same benefit as the producers. And that's what the ideal free distribution says. We distribute ourselves in such a way that the benefits that we get are equal across the entire group. And we're not doing that out of altruism. We're doing that because every individual is pursuing its goal, in this case, to get the most food possible. But in everybody striving to get the most food possible, they have different strategies for getting there, and the end result is everybody gets the same amount of food. Questions about that? Have you guys ever been whale watching?
Well,
Whale watching. Go to a coast, like go to New England or something, and go on a whale watching tour. One of the things that whales do when they're fishing is if they find a group of krill or something like this, they'll actually go around in a circle and they'll blow bubbles up. They'll release oxygen, release air in a circle around this group of krill. And what the bubbles do is it makes the water feel like there's an edge to it, or there's a barrier there. And it's just a barrier formed by bubbles bubbling up to the surface. And you can notice this when you're on the surface of the water because you'll see these circles of bubbles breaking the surface. And what they do is after they've let that kind of cage of air go up, the whales will come up through the middle of it with their mouths wide open and basically just intercept that pile of krill that they've isolated by this little kind of air cage. And though it's a very effective way of hunting for them. But one of the things that you will notice about that behavior is flying over the surface of the water will be seabirds. And as the whales are doing this, the seabirds know that they're aggregating food within those circles. And after the whale breaches and has all the food and then goes back down in the water, you'll see all these seabirds swoop down and pick off all of the krill that the whale didn't end up eating. This is another one of those classic examples of the whale being a producer, and in this case, a different species being a scrounger species. The whale is doing all this work, and these birds are benefiting as a result of it. All right, so your book uses the term strategies and tactics, and sometimes they're not terribly consistent with how they use these terms, partly because the terms are a little squishy to begin with. But a strategy is generally referred to as a genetically based decision rule. So the strategy of hawk and dove, that would be a strategy if an individual was genetically predisposed to play hawk and another individual was genetically predisposed to play dove. We've talked about this back when we were talking about evolutionary games. You can have a ratio of these two strategies by either that strategy being genetically encoded in the individual, or by having a flexible encoding that allows you to play hawk in some cases and dove in other cases. And so a strategy could also be due to a conditional strategy where you play hawk under one set of conditions and you play dove under another set of conditions. And so if it's condition dependent, it can still be a strategy. A tactic, on the other hand, might be a behavior pattern that is played as part of a particular strategy. So for me, the best way to demonstrate this to you was to provide you with an example. Oftentimes when this is true. This is true of a lot of fish, but it's true of a lot of things. But I think the term was basically um, first proposed and used in reference to fish. Fish will oftentimes set up breeding territories, and the male defends the breeding territory. And if another male comes into the breeding territory, the resident of the territory will fight off the male. And in those territories, it's almost always size dependent. The larger male always wins that competition, that particular interaction. And so um, there are other males, though, in some species, when you're a small male, you're still mature, but you're small, you actually don't look like a male. Instead, you look like a female. And when you're a fish, what happens is you've created your nest and you have induced a female to come into your nest, and you're a big fat male with angry eyes and big teeth, and you're ready to defend your territory from another male coming in. And so because you're a big male, you have a territory, and you get females, and they come in and they lay their eggs. And then after they have laid their eggs, you squirt your sperm all over those eggs, and they become fertilized. But if you're a small male, you could opt to try and fight this male, boot him off of his territory, take over his eggs, and get some more eggs yourself from females coming by. But if you're a small male, you're probably not going to win that fight. And what has happened evolutionarily is over time, these small male fish actually have the same morphology, the same phenotype, outward appearance of a female. And what these smaller males will do is they will come in here, they will bat their eyelashes at the resident male, maybe have some smoochy lips, and they will sneak in there. This male thinks that this is a female, but this is actually just a young male. He gets in there and he's like, oh, well, I'm going to squirt my sperm onto those eggs also. This male eventually figures out what's going on because rather than depositing eggs, this female is depositing sperm, chases him out, but he has managed to sneak in there and get a shot at some of those eggs. So you have two particular ways of going about this. You can fight, or you can sneak. And in this case, these could be hardwired kinds of strategies in that some individuals are always sneakers and some individuals are fighters. But in the case of fishes, it's often fight if you're large, sneak if you are small. That's a strategy also, but that strategy is conditional on what your particular state happens to be. As soon as you get big enough to fight, your morphology changes and you stop looking like a female and you look like a male. You undergo a morphological change that changes with size, and all of a sudden, you're no longer a sneaker male, you're now actually a resident holder, and your strategy then becomes fight because you're big enough to fight and defend the territory. So a strategy could be either fight all the time versus sneak all the time, or it could be a conditional strategy where you fight if you're above a certain size and you sneak if you're below that certain size. If the strategy is fight above threshold X or sneak below threshold X, then fight and sneak are tactics within this particular strategy. And that's how your book uses the term strategy versus tactic. The only reason that I mention this is that your book does go into some detail about this, and the idea of strategies and tactics are things that you see in the animal behavior literature fairly common. Um, your book makes this point fairly strongly, and then proceeds to not adhere very strongly to their own distinction between these two terms, which is unfortunate, but it's something that you just kind of have to deal with. So there's all kinds of dependencies in nature, which we will talk about next week because we are at the end of our time. So the natterjack toad example and the lizard example we will cover next Monday. And so we will end test material with strategies versus tactics. Emily emailed me that you guys want to get together tomorrow at 10:30 to have a review session. Is that correct? That is what she communicated with me. All right, we'll just meet up in lab, and I'll answer whatever questions you have, and then we'll have a test on Wednesday, and then there's no class on Friday, and then you have spring break. We will meet in lab on Thursday because Mason, they saved some rolling for you, and so they'll put the caterpillars that they made onto wires. You'll roll out your caterpillars, but my guess is we probably won't even be there the whole time. But you'll get yours rolled out. We'll get all of them mounted on wires, and then we're just waiting for it to stop being winter because clearly we're not going to deploy them on Thursday because it's supposed to be 3.5 inches of snow. But my goal would be, and my goal always has been, if you look in the schedule, to have the prep of the caterpillars done before spring break, so then we're free to deploy them whenever it's nice enough.
It was kind of difficult. So we did.
It's
we would have done them all, but they're kind of difficult.
it's very tedious, and I did go back up and check on you guys before the lab was over, and you had left, but then I saw that they left you a pile of ones to roll out yourself. So.
We did what?
Oh, we rolled everything out and cut everything, and they look fine. Yeah.
But no.
So we layered them. We layered the monarch ones, and we cut them into little squares. Now they had to be shaped into caterpillar shape.
When the black clay was like sticking.
No.
When I had to leave, I remember black.
No, I ended up having to like roll it out on wax paper.
We rolled it out on wax paper, and that was much better, actually. Yeah. Yeah, so we got it all assembled and everything and got most of it cut last week. And then, 2 weeks ago. Well, no, yeah, 2 weeks ago. And then last week, we did a little more cutting and started rolling. Yeah. But the rolling is tedious. You have to be careful. You have to be slow. But you have 3 people who have done a lot of it last week, and they can show you how when we're in lab. I looked at them, and
I had one good one. That was it.
many of them are much better than a lot of the ones that Kiara and Rose used actually out in the field. And it worked for them. Actually, I was just looking at the data the other day.
Can we meet in here tomorrow? That way we can use all the whiteboards.
I don't think, well, I don't know if the room is available tomorrow.
Oh.
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, so also tomorrow, well, no, on Thursday, I'll show you the old data that we have from the caterpillar experiment so you kind of know what it looks like. But yeah. I feel like I spend my life recording things.